I was sitting in a hushed, wood-paneled office near Whitehall recently, watching a senior official sign off on a new round of maritime sanctions. There was this palpable sense of triumph in the room, a quiet, self-assured nod as the fountain pen met the heavy cream paper. To the people in that room, this wasn't just bureaucracy. It was, a strategic strike. They spoke with a kind of giddy moral certainty, convinced they had just tightened a digital noose around the neck of a global superpower.
Right.
The official leaned back, adjusted his silk tie, and whispered, "That should stop the flow." But as he spoke, I looked at a live maritime tracker on a nearby tablet. Halfway across the world, in the humid, salt-thick air of the Malacca Strait, a rusted supertanker, one that technically didn't exist, according to the document he just signed, was riding low in the water, heavy with 2 million barrels of crude.
Wow.
It had no Western insurance, no recognizable flag, and certainly no regard for the cream-colored paper in London. It was a shadow vessel, part of a ghost fleet moving toward an industrial port in the east that was, frankly, hungrier for energy than for Western approval.
The contrast is just stark.
It was jarring. In London, you have the legalistic illusion, this belief that the world is still governed by signatures and moral consensus. And then, in the Strait, you have the material reality. The cold, oily truth that industry and sovereign demand override edicts.
And that instantaneous disconnect you're describing, that's it.
Exactly. That disconnect between the polite ritual of the sanction and the gritty, unstoppable flow of global trade, it left me with a realization. We aren't just witnessing a policy shift. We're watching the twilight ritual of a civilization that has traded its hammers for pens and its engines for regulations. It raises a question most are too afraid to ask. What happens to a global order when its only weapon left is a piece of paper that the rest of the world has stopped reading?
That image, that profound juxtaposition you describe, is precisely the strategic shift we have to unpack for you today.
Yeah.
It's the core mission of this deep dive. We are observing the twilight of a global system that historically relied on moral consensus, on complex legal architecture, and, well, paper edicts. And we're watching it collide with the grounded, realistic economic interests and tangible material logistics of other major global powers.
So this is the transition you're talking about.
It's a transition from Western financial hegemony to East Asian industrial realism. And it demonstrates how physical control over global energy supply chains and manufacturing bases just renders those traditional paper-based sanctions obsolete in a multipolar world.
That is a staggering claim. The idea that our most sophisticated financial weapons are being neutralized by something as simple and, I guess, brute force as logistics and industrial capacity.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
We've become so accustomed to the idea that banking power, the ability to freeze accounts, halt transactions, cancel insurance, is the ultimate lever of statecraft. But you're arguing that if countries control the physical means of production and the routes of energy transport,
they can simply bypass the legal strictures entirely. That is exactly what the source material points toward.
So it's that simple.
If one geopolitical bloc attempts to stop the flow of a vital commodity like crude oil based on paper rules, another unconstrained bloc driven by raw energy demand will just step in using tangible assets, ships, ports, and industrial processing capacity.
And that brings us face to face with the engine of that material reality you mentioned.
The shadow fleet.
We hear that term a lot, shadow fleet, but we need a precise definition. Is this just a few criminal organizations, or are we talking about something bigger, a parallel functioning economy?
It is fundamentally a parallel trading system. It's informal in its political structure, sure, but it's highly organized and extremely effective in its operation.
So it works.
It works. Its entire function is to operate outside the traditional Western financial and legal control structures, the very system that enforces the sanctions, to ensure that strategic cargo, primarily oil, can still be exported at market prices. It completely bypasses those restrictions.
A system built not on cash then, but on
infrastructure. Exactly.
So this wasn't created overnight in response to the most recent conflicts. Who pioneered the necessary blueprint for this kind of operation?
The origins are really well documented, and they predate current global tensions by over a decade. The pioneer of shadow shipping is unquestionably Iran.
Iran?
Yes. They began to systematically develop this alternative logistics chain in the early 2010s, following the imposition of stringent U.S. nuclear sanctions designed specifically to isolate their oil exports.
Initially, I recall their methods being relatively crude, relying on simple evasion tactics.
They were. They started with what we call ad hoc measures. A single tanker physically turning off its automatic identification system, or AIS, which broadcasts a vessel's position.
So they just go dark.
They go dark.
Oh.
They would also engage in high seas transfers, swapping crude oil from one vessel to another and frequently changing flags to obscure the oil's origin. But this quickly matured.
Matured into something more formal.
Into a formal, structured logistics system managed through very sophisticated means.
And what did that formalization look like in practice? What did they actually do?
It involved creating these elaborate webs of ownership. They registered these ships through complex offshore companies and then systematically utilized flags of convenience from jurisdictions that deliberately chose not to align with Western unilateral sanctions.
Which flags are we talking about?
We see names appearing repeatedly in the sources: Tanzania, Palau, and the Comoros. By using these flags and shell companies, they could separate the vessel's operation from the country under sanction, making it exceptionally difficult for Western authorities to target and prosecute.
That level of obfuscation sounds incredibly effective. I mean, how much of Iran's exports were able to leverage this system?
At its height, the sources estimate that up to 70% of Iranian oil was moved through these shadow roads. 70%.
70. Wow.
And the commodities were often traded through third countries, China being the primary destination, using complex schemes involving fictitious transactions, renaming vessels.
They even repainted the ships.
They even physically repainted the ship hulls in remote ports to completely launder the ship's identity before it reappeared on the grid.
Once that playbook was established, I have to imagine it was only a matter of time until other sanctioned states adopted it.
Absolutely. Venezuela is the clearest example. Following U.S. sanctions in 2019, the state oil company, PDVSA, swiftly adopted the Iranian model.
And started shipping to Asia.
Primarily to Asia, specifically China and India, utilizing key transshipment zones like Singapore and Malaysia. What is especially fascinating is how they acquired their fleet capacity.
How did they?
Lacking cash, Venezuela relied heavily on barter arrangements. They were trading crude oil directly in exchange for vital services like vessel maintenance, specialized fuel, or even large shipments of food.
So they were insulating their operations even further from Western financial systems.
Completely. It speaks volumes about the capacity for industrial-scale resilience when financial tools are the only weapon used against sovereign resource control.
So what is the sheer volume of this network today, especially now with larger economies facing restrictions?
The scale is, well, it's immense now. As of 2025, the Shadow Fleet is estimated to number many hundreds of vessels, with the vast majority transporting strategic cargo, particularly oil.
This isn't a peripheral operation, then?
Not at all. It is central to global energy supply, and we can quantify the total impact. From 2017 through 2023, an average of 7.8 million metric tons of crude oil per month were exported via these dark ships from sanctioned nations. That includes Iran, Syria, Venezuela, and now Russia.
7.8 million metric tons per month. That represents, what, nearly half of the world's seaborne crude exports from that group of nations?
Precisely. That staggering figure represents approximately 43% of total world seaborne crude oil exports originating from those sanctioned states during that period.
So it shows the Shadow Fleet is not some small-scale criminal evasion.
It's a major, stable, parallel global trading system that ensures commodities continue to flow regardless of Western policy.
Let's delve into the mechanics of evasion, then. To achieve this scale and remain so resilient, they must be employing highly sophisticated maneuvers beyond just, turning off a switch. How do they maintain plausible deniability?
It relies on a multi-layered approach to deception. The foundational tactic, as we said, remains AI and manipulation.
The automatic identification system.
Right. It's meant to broadcast a vessel's location, speed, and heading for safety and tracking. Deliberately deactivating or tampering with these transceivers creates dark or ghost ships that physically disappear from standard global tracking systems, sometimes for weeks at a time as they sail across oceans.
When a massive tanker carrying millions of barrels of oil just disappears, you'd think that would trigger alarms across global enforcement agencies. What happens when it reappears?
That's where the legal and financial engineering kicks in, what you could call the process of ship identity laundering.
Laundering the ship itself.
Yes. Vessels rely on complex, constantly changing chains of shell companies and routine flag changes to obscure who truly owns the ship and where the cargo originated. We see heavy use of flags of convenience like Cameroon, Liberia, and Tanzania. And these flags are changed rapidly. In rapid succession, a single U.S. Treasury report highlighted 6 vessels involved in evasion, all of which subsequently switched flags. 5 moved to Cameroon and 1 to Tanzania, almost immediately after being identified.
Why are those specific flags of convenience, like Cameroon or Palau, more effective than the more, say, traditional large registries like Liberia or Panama?
That's a crucial distinction. While Liberia and Panama are popular for their low taxes and relaxed regulations, their financial and legal systems are often deeply intertwined with U.S. and European banking, insurance, and legal oversight bodies.
I see, so they're more vulnerable to pressure.
Exactly. By contrast, smaller jurisdictions like Cameroon or Tanzania have significantly fewer ties, making them less susceptible to the direct, quick action of Western regulators or the long-arm reach of U.S. financial instruments. The constant renaming, repainting, and flag hopping makes any attempt at asset seizure or liability enforcement an administrative nightmare.
And when the oil needs to be physically transferred without entering a major regulated port,
they rely heavily on ship-to-ship transfers, or STS. This involves reloading the cargo from one tanker, often the dark ship, to another on the high seas.
out in international waters.
Right, outside the territorial jurisdiction of any single nation. While STS transfers are legitimate activities when they're regulated, performing them in this context pushes them into a massive legal gray zone. It makes it incredibly difficult to enforce any sanction, particularly when ownership is so obscured.
And these transfers are happening in specific areas globally, right? Not just anywhere.
They cluster in specific zones where surveillance is difficult and international waters are easily accessible, off the coast of Greece, near Malaysia, or off Morocco.
And there's a technique to it.
Oh, absolutely. These transfers are often deliberately timed to occur during overlapping AI gaps. Both vessels will simultaneously turn off their transceivers, perform the transfer in complete darkness, and then turn them back on in a synchronized manner, maximizing the plausible deniability of what transpired between them.
The risk must be enormous.
It is. This entire operation generates considerable risks, which the International Maritime Organization flagged as high risk years ago, noting how high seas STS transfers fundamentally undermine maritime safety, environmental protection, and liability regimes.
This meticulous logistical system is operating entirely counter to the legal architecture we discussed at the start. So, if the West's primary weapon is the law, and that law is so easily circumvented or just ignored, then we have to look inward. What is weakening the foundation of Western legalism?
And that brings us to the geopolitical weakness that's inherent in our systems. We have to consider how the institutions responsible for generating and projecting this legal power, the policy-making bodies in London, Washington, Brussels, are structurally constrained. It's a concept sometimes referred to as Vitocracy.
Okay, let's delve into that concept. What exactly is a Vitocracy, and how does it prevent an effective response?
Well, drawing on political theory about state decay, a Vitocracy is when a system that was originally designed with checks and balances, to prevent tyranny or bad policy, becomes so fragmented with checks that it severely impairs the government's capacity to act decisively or implement necessary reforms.
So you have too many veto points.
Too many. You have divided government, highly adversarial interest groups, and an increasingly unaccountable regulatory state, all possessing the power to veto, slow down, or legally challenge any major action.
So the system has perfected the art of prevention to the detriment of action. If a crisis erupts, like a tanker collision involving one of these sanctioned vessels, the regulatory framework in a Western capital might spend weeks just arguing over which committee has jurisdiction.
Or which insurance entity is liable, or whether the proposed enforcement action will even survive judicial review.
Right.
Exactly. This procedural gridlock is the operational failure of the legalistic illusion. You contrast this complex, slow-moving system with the ideal of good government, which theorists define as capable, impersonal, well-organized, and autonomous.
And the other powers don't have this problem.
When major industrial powers operating outside the Western legal orbit don't have this debilitating Vitocracy, their ability to execute massive material projects like establishing a resilient global ghost fleet becomes significantly more efficient and faster. They are optimized for output, not for procedural review.
And this procedural aging, this preference for legal form over material substance, it echoes some broader philosophical concerns about the trajectory of Western civilization itself.
It connects directly to the Spenglerian interpretation of decline. Oswald Spengler argued that a civilization, in its late phase, transitions from a creative culture based on shared spiritual ideals to a reflective, purely material civilization.
Right. And this late phase is marked by
a turn towards skepticism, materialism, and a focus on hypersubjectivism in art and thought.
Okay, but how does that academic shift from culture to civilization relate to our ability to enforce sanctions against a supertanker in the Malacca Strait?
The link is crucial. International law relies on a shared objective belief in its moral authority. When a society shifts toward hypersubjectivism, believing there is no universal objective moral truth, only subjective political viewpoints, that shared belief in objective international law, the paper edict, begins to decay.
So non-compliant states can just dismiss it.
They can easily justify ignoring sanctions, dismissing them not as violations of law, but as mere subjective political maneuvering by a competing power. The legalistic illusion represents this aging system, struggling to assert its paper authority against the modern industrial world's material demands.
So when all you have left are paper weapons sanctions that only function if the entire world shares your belief in their moral imperative, that's when the weakness becomes manifest.
Yes, and we see this weakness laid bare in multilateral institutions like the UN.
How so?
The sanctions regimes we create, whether against North Korea, Iran, or others, are necessarily broad and incredibly complex. They depend entirely on global legal architecture and, crucially, a global consensus for compliance. But that architecture is hollowed out when key non-Western states, particularly those with veto power on the UN Security Council, are unwilling to cooperate.
Give us the most recent striking example of that failure.
It just happened in April 2024. Russia used its veto power to block the renewal of the panel of experts tasked with monitoring North Korean sanctions implementation.
And that panel was?
That panel was the UN's central, impartial mechanism for gathering intelligence, sharing surveillance data, and coordinating global enforcement efforts against North Korea's illicit trade and proliferation activities.
So by vetoing the renewal, Russia essentially blinded the international community to one of the most serious sanction evasion operations in history.
Exactly. Without the active compliance and assistance of permanent members like China and Russia on the UNSC, any efforts to coordinate surveillance and enforcement against these highly sophisticated shadow networks become almost impossible.
The paper is signed, the law is written.
But the mechanism for verifying and enforcing it is systematically disabled by the very members meant to uphold it. The legal architecture is intact, but the political will to enforce it is gone. It just proves that physical reality and political interests override the legalistic assumption.
Okay, so if the West is constrained by this Vitocracy, what is the competing material reality that East Asian nations are leveraging to succeed where the West's policies are failing?
And now we shift entirely from legalism to the tangible. Industrial realism. This is the triumph of high-efficiency state capacity, predominantly seen in East Asian nations, which prioritizes measurable, tangible infrastructure and industrial development.
Right.
These systems often feature a meritocratic, focused government that builds and maintains physical assets, steel mills, ports, shipyards, which are inherently resilient to financial sanctions.
It's easy to freeze a financial asset on a screen, but you can't sanction a shipyard or prevent a crane from lifting cargo unless you physically destroy it.
And that's a military action.
An entirely different level of risk.
That is the core difference. The material economy operates outside the easy reach of financial edicts. And this physical control extends to strategic choke points. We see Beijing's growing dominance over critical industries, specifically foundational chips, and the mining and processing of critical minerals.
So this control over production and material inputs, the physical supply chain, is a powerful form of leverage.
A form of leverage that far surpasses the efficacy of purely financial measures.
This raises the debate about whether raw industrial metrics, tons of steel, barrels of cement, still matter in a 21st century military or geopolitical context. Modern defense is so hyper-complex and technological.
That is the central analytical conflict. Defense analysts often argue that modern equipment of fighter jets, sophisticated missiles, advanced tanks are bespoke, complex, and produced in small batches by highly skilled labor.
More like luxury cars.
Exactly. More like luxury cars than the mass-produced platforms of earlier conflicts. They are procured slowly over decades, often serving for 40 or 50 years.
And if you look at the U.S. defense industrial base, it's highly specialized and deeply reliant on sole source suppliers and strict regulatory regimes like ITAR, the International Traffic and Arms Regulations. This complexity inherently limits rapid scaling.
That's correct. The reliance on highly specialized single-source suppliers and the lengthy regulatory hurdles mean that while the quality is unmatched, the pace of production is glacial compared to wartime needs. If the U.S. Navy needs 500 missiles, they might get 20 a year. This makes the system inflexible and brittle under sustained pressure.
But the Shadow Fleet operates in the material realm, fueled by basic industrial inputs. Doesn't that scale still matter if a prolonged conflict requires rapid replacement or massive consumption?
Yes, it absolutely does. Industrial capacity remains the immovable upper limit for a total war scenario or a prolonged conflict of attrition.
I see.
If a conflict requires rapidly producing hundreds or thousands of basic platforms per year, or simply replacing the volume of ammunition that is consumed at unexpectedly high rates, as we have seen in recent conflicts, many countries, especially in the West, are simply unprepared because that basic industrial base has been outsourced or purposefully shrunk.
So the ability to rapidly surge production of basic materials is the true strategic asset here.
Absolutely. The critical factor is retaining the capacity for basic industrial inputs: coal, iron, steel, aluminum, and crucially, maintaining the skilled workforce and the knowledge necessary to work those inputs on an industrial scale.
Right, because stockpiles aren't enough.
Some policy arguments suggest that it's cheaper to just stockpile materials, but this is short-sighted. Stockpiles eventually run out, and if you have lost the foundational knowledge base, the machinery, and the skilled labor to produce steel or aluminum at scale, you have lost strategic autonomy.
And when we look at the raw metrics of foundational production today, the divergence between the legacy system and the rising industrial powers is stunning.
It confirms the material shift. China, for instance, produces well over 10 times the amount of steel the U.S. does annually.
10 times.
Now, this raw tonnage doesn't dictate which side wins a skirmish tomorrow. Military power is complex and involves much more than raw steel, but it confirms that in a contest of prolonged industrial output and endurance, the upper limit of scale for the rising powers is drastically different.
And this massive, resilient industrial base provides the tangible infrastructure that makes the Ghost Fleet and subsequent sanction evasion fundamentally viable.
Right.
So the West relies on financial pressure and legal compliance, but if you have a non-Western power that controls the physical supply chain, the raw materials, the shipyards, the fuel, they can simply bypass, refuel, and wait out the sanctions, which leads us directly to the complex macroeconomic consequences.
And the unavoidable reality of what we can call the sanction paradox. This is where the conflicting interests facing Western policymakers become really apparent.
Okay, so how does this paradox manifest in commodity markets?
Well, sanctions aim to inflict severe economic damage on the target country. However, Western countries, particularly those in Europe, still need Russian oil to remain flowing on the global market.
Right, because we're all removed.
If the Russian crude supply were entirely removed from circulation, analysts predict crude prices could easily increase dramatically, potentially stabilizing around $200 a barrel.
Which would trigger global inflation and destabilize Western energy markets completely.
Dramatically. So they are trying to hurt the target without imposing catastrophic self-harm, which requires this incredibly delicate, almost self-defeating balancing act.
And the mechanism they chose for that was the price cap.
Exactly. The $60 per barrel price cap on Russian crude, enforceable through denying Western maritime services, specifically insurance. The goal was stabilization of global prices, coupled with limiting Russian revenue. What has happened in practice, however, is that this mechanism has been exploited, often to the advantage of non-Western operators.
How are shadow operators capitalizing on the price cap itself?
Well, the cap only works if the vessel is using Western services, primarily the protection and indemnity clubs or P&I clubs, which are the main Western maritime liability insurers.
Okay.
Because the Shadow Fleet uses non-Western insurance, often domestic Russian pools or brokers in places like India or Dubai, they are not beholden to the cap.
I see.
So these non-Western operators charge extremely high prices for shipping and insurance because of the increased risk. These inflated costs are now being captured by the shadow operators, allowing Russian sellers to sell their crude at close to market price, with the shadow fleet essentially capturing the high freight costs that the price cap was designed to suppress.
That is a stunning unintended consequence. The policy designed to limit Russian revenue has essentially created a highly profitable new market for shadow operators and allowed overall Russian energy revenue to rebound.
It created a brand new, resilient trading ecosystem. Despite initial fluctuations, Russian oil and gas revenues saw a significant rebound. And this entire new ecosystem is anchored by non-Western trading hubs and destinations.
China is the pivotal actor in this entire shift. They're the primary, consistent destination for Iranian, Venezuelan, and now Russian crude.
And they never joined the embargo. They strategically chose not to join the EU's embargo, and they accounted for 40% of Russian oil sales in 2021. Critically, Chinese companies and authorities facilitate the operation of the shadow fleet by allowing blacklisted vessels to trade through their massive ports and offering alternatives to the US dollar for transactions,
Which ensures the flow continues.
uninterrupted.
And India's role has also evolved dramatically in this context.
India became the single biggest buyer of seaborne Russian crude, importing around 10% of Russian oil in the first part of 2023. This strategic pivot highlights that India and other developing nations like Brazil and Turkey prioritize economic self-interest, reliable energy supply, and flexibility over strict alignment with Western sanctions.
So they're hedging their bets.
They're actively seeking to maintain fluid relationships with all major powers, the US, China, and Russia, as a strategic insurance policy against major power conflicts.
If China and India are the primary consumers, where does the financial and logistical coordination take place?
The UAE, and specifically the port of Fujairah, has become absolutely critical. The UAE has served as a key financial and logistical hub, facilitating transactions and offering anonymity. Almost half of the top 20 traders of Russian crude oil registered there in the first 4 months of 2023.
And they're also storing the oil there.
Fujairah's storage capacity for Russian oil increased dramatically, serving as a major transfer and clearinghouse point for sanctioned crude destined for Asia.
So this discounted, obscured oil is flowing into these major industrial powers. How does this dark shipping network affect the broader global economy, including the West?
The network functions as a unique, powerful economic transmission belt, with China acting as the crucial intermediary.
A transmission belt. How?
When unexpected sanction shocks occur, they initially reduce recorded oil exports, leading to potential price instability. However, the Ghost Fleet quickly mitigates the potential for dramatic global oil price spikes by ensuring supply stability.
So we avoid the $200 barrel price shock, which is a major victory for global stability. But that stability is bought through the very shadow economy the West is trying to suppress.
It is the ultimate economic paradox. China, as the largest importer of this deeply discounted dark-shipped oil, benefits from lower oil import costs. This directly boosts its already immense industrial production capacity.
And here's where the transmission belt connects back to the West.
Exactly. Because the US and EU economies are deeply reliant on China within global supply networks for everything from consumer goods to manufactured components, this massive rebound in cheap Chinese industrial production actually provides crucial short-term support and stability for industrial production in the US and the EU.
That is breathtaking. The sanctioned oil moves on ghost ships, lands in China cheap, fuels massive Chinese manufacturing output, and that output effectively prevents a deeper industrial contraction in the very Western economies that impose the sanctions. The sanction attempts are indirectly subsidizing the global stability the West needs.
The material reality of trade and supply chains demonstrates that you cannot unilaterally cut off a global commodity without suffering consequences, unless you fully control the entire chain, from extraction and transport to processing and consumption. The world is just too integrated for isolated financial attacks to work against determined industrial powers.
While we focused on the high-level strategy and macroeconomics, we have to acknowledge that this entire parallel operation is built on highly risky, poorly regulated activity involving aging vessels. This inevitably carries a tremendous, tangible human and environmental toll.
That is the crucial hidden cost. The shadow fleet introduces catastrophic risks because it fundamentally bypasses international safety and liability structures. These ships are, on average, older than those in the legitimate fleet and frequently operate outside international safety standards set by critical bodies like the IMO and the SOLAS Convention.
Right, because when you remove Western insurance and legal oversight,
You remove the primary financial incentive for maintenance and safety compliance.
So if the ships are using these obscure flags and non-Western insurance, who is responsible when the inevitable accident happens?
That is the core legal black hole. We see a significant increase in maritime risk. For instance, the high seas ship-to-ship transfers, which are vital to the ghost fleet, were flagged as high-risk activities as far back as 2013 for undermining safety, environmental protection, and accountability.
Can you give us a concrete example of an incident that illustrates this lack of accountability?
A clear case was the collision in the Gulf of Oman between the Front Eagle and the tanker Adelan. The Adelan was publicly known to be sanctioned for moving Russian oil, yet after the collision, the anonymous owners of the Adelan could not be reached by the colliding company.
They just couldn't find them.
Enforcement efforts traced the vessel operator only to an old, nondescript office complex in Navi Mumbai, India, which had no public directory confirmation. This anonymity is the system. It cripples any attempt at assigning legal or financial accountability immediately following a disaster.
An anonymous ship with anonymous ownership carrying obscured cargo involved in a collision. That is the terrifying reality of ghost ship operation.
And we've seen similar risks with older high-risk vessels running aground or colliding in other regions. For example, the vessel Liberty, carrying Venezuelan oil, ran aground near Indonesia. It was over 23 years old and had a documented history of being deemed high risk in multiple prior inspections.
And there was another one.
The Petition, involved in transporting Venezuelan crude, was involved in a collision in Cuba. These incidents illustrate the recurring pattern of using substandard, aging vessels precisely because they are cheap, expendable, and easily obscured.
The ultimate financial consequence of an oil spill is the liability. If the vessel has no Western insurance, who pays for the cleanup?
This creates a major shift in liability, effectively turning a private, often illicit enterprise into a public environmental debt. Since shadow tankers operate almost entirely outside the Western insurance umbrella, any major oil spill or maritime accident in foreign waters forces the local government authorities and their taxpayers to bear the massive cost of cleanup and environmental remediation.
This cost transfer is staggering.
It is. By August 2023, estimates show that almost 3/4 of all seaborne Russian crude flows traveled without Western insurance.
So if there's an accident?
If a major accident were to occur in, say, the Baltic Sea or the Gulf of Finland, the taxpayers of countries like Finland or Sweden would be financially responsible for the environmental disaster caused by an anonymous vessel serving a geopolitical rival.
And beyond the environment and the taxpayer, the negative effects extend to the personnel, the crews working these routes.
Absolutely. The human toll is often severe. The crews on these old, poorly maintained, dark ships are frequently unaware of their vessel's role in the shadow fleet.
So they don't even know.
Often not. They face extreme dangers due to substandard safety equipment, poor living conditions, and the lack of proper training for high-risk operations, like high-seas STS transfers. The tragic case of the MT Pablo highlighted how quickly seafarers can be harmed or lose their lives on these dark ships, exposing the human cost embedded within this geopolitical strategy. This brings us back to our starting point and that contrast you painted so vividly. Western policy tools are relying on legalistic assumptions, often constrained by a legacy system that has devolved into a Vitocracy, a bureaucracy optimized for procedure and gridlock.
Right.
Simultaneously, non-Western industrial powers are leveraging pure industrial realism and controlling material flows to not just survive, but to create sustainable, parallel trading systems that effectively neutralize those carefully crafted paper edicts.
The profound reality this deep dive confirms is the growing disconnect between sovereign demand for vital energy and the capacity of the legacy global order to enforce its regulatory edicts. The strategic importance of the physical flow of oil and the infrastructure used to move it has unequivocally confirmed that the material reality of trade now overrides the legalistic illusion of paper.